So I found that when I give talks lately, in order to get people's attention, I have to answer questions that's on everybody's mind, which is, how do I get one of these fashion accessories? I'm recovering from some back surgery, and contrary to what some people have scurrilously reported, I am not suffering from a weakening of the spine due to too many years of groveling for government grants. I do grovel. I'm quite expert at it, but only in a very ergonomic way. No, actually, I did have some back surgery that caused some neurological damage, but I am actually recovering from it, so that's the good news. I'm going to be talking today about some ideas that Patricia Lannon and I developed in the course of conversations over a number of years as we began to think about some of the things that people are thinking about in this room. She could take exception to anything that I say in the question period, because I didn't give her a chance to look at the last rendition of what it is I'm going to say here. So, a riveting story in our cultural and spiritual history, and it certainly made for great art, but not a very good representation of really what we're talking about when we're talking about children's exposure to violence. And in fact, this is a little bit characteristic of the problem that we have in raising awareness about children's exposure to violence, is that these kinds of terrible tragedies are the ones that tend to capture people's imagination and tend to get all the focus, where the kind of mundane kinds of violence that children experience at the home and at the hands of peers is much harder to get people's attention to. But we have been improving on that. But I do want to emphasize several features about children's exposure to violence that I don't think have gotten sufficient attention. You may be aware of some of this, but I just think emphasizing these few points are worth starting out with. First of all, children have higher rates of exposure to violence than do other segments of the population. They suffer all the kinds of crimes and violence that adults do, but they have some special ones that are specific to their condition of being children, things like neglect and sexual abuse. And there is increasing amount of evidence to support this from surveys. So any of the crime victim surveys that actually include children in their samples do show higher rates. This is from the National Crime Victimization Survey in the United States, showing rates of assault and rape and robbery that are 2 to 3 times higher for the teenage component of that population than is the case for adults. This is from a family violence survey looking at intrafamilial assaults, showing about a 5 times greater vulnerability of kids to domestic violence and 3 times greater vulnerability to severe violence. There's also data from the British Crime Survey, which I didn't include in this compendium, that also shows higher rates for kids than adults. So that's one feature of violence against kids. Secondly, it's likely more pervasive in its impact. It's a little bit hard to be sure about, but we certainly do know about considerable long-term effects, and even in twin studies that show that among identical twins who've been exposed to various kinds of early childhood abuse, they have long-term effects that their co-twin does not have, and that these impacts extend well into adulthood. So there's likely more pervasive effects to violence. We do know about we do know that violence in childhood affects developmental transitions and sequences that are very important. A third feature about children's exposure to violence is that it's primordial to other kinds of violence. There's considerable amount of research that shows that children who've been exposed to violence are more likely to be victims or offenders when they get to be adults. And they're also more likely to have pro-violence attitudes about all kinds of things, including public policy, the death penalty, and the use of corporal punishment in their own families of procreation. So there's this primordial nature to childhood violence. A fourth feature is that a lot of violence and crime in childhood is outside the purview of typical violence control agencies. So if you think of the main institutions that we have that deal with violence in the adult world, like the police, criminal sanctions, incarceration, dispute resolution mechanisms for avoiding the kind of vigilante justice, a lot of that really doesn't apply to the things that we most think about when we're talking about childhood exposure to violence, the violence of parents against their children or peers against other children. And that does strongly suggest that we need separate strategies dealing with separate institutions for dealing with violence in childhood compared to what we would be thinking about in terms of solutions for adult violence. And finally, the fragmentation. This is, I think, a serious and pervasive problem in addressing exposure in childhood because a lot of it is balkanized or fragmented or siloed. I happen to like the chimney metaphor, stovepipes. But throughout the world, you have different groups of people working on different aspects of the childhood violence exposure problem. I just went to a meeting in Japan, for example, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. You almost never hear anyone talking about school crime, school violence, and yet this is very much part of the whole child protection need. I do have, just a little aside, this is a concept I call developmental victimology, which is an attempt to bring all of this together into a kind of more comprehensive, integrated, conceptual whole, but I'm not going to go into that today, just for those of you who are interested in getting more information about it. So, can we reduce children's exposure to violence by 50%? Well, yes we can. We already have in the United States, according to many indicators. This is a really pretty amazing story that I think has not gotten enough attention. There are a lot of surveys, a lot of accumulating data that's showing really dramatic declines in both youth victimization and offending over the last 20 years. I'm just going to put up a few of these. Here is the data on trends in violent victimization at school for youth 12 to 17-year-old, a 74% decline since 1993. Here's data for sexual assaults to teenagers. Also a big decline supported by a number of other surveys, over 2/3 up through 2008. Here's data from police arrests of juveniles and adults. You can see declines for both juveniles and adults, but in the most recent 10-year period, the declines for juveniles actually are a bit bigger than the declines for adults. And interestingly, in almost all of these indicators, the declines continued after the economic recession of 2008 set in, which was, I think, quite remarkable that it was whatever was happening was kind of resistant to those larger macro trends. In parent-to-child violence, we see similar improvements. Here is the decline in substantiated physical abuse in the child protection agencies aggregated throughout the United States. A little bit of a concerning increase in the most recent data period, but we've seen that before, and the declines have continued, but over a 50% decline. We have some surveys that show declines in corporal punishment. Unfortunately, none very recently, and the declines have been larger for punishment of the older kids than the younger kids. I have a lot of these ski slope images. They've accused me of being a shill for the New Hampshire ski industry. I'm not going to put them all up, but it is, many of you may not have heard this either, but it's not just the crime and violence, but there have been a number of other pretty remarkable child welfare improvements in the United States during the same period of time. Not just sexual abuse, but teenage pregnancy is down by more than half. Risky sexual behavior is down considerably. The number of young people report having multiple sexual partners. Both youth suicide and particularly suicide ideation is down considerably. Running away is down by almost 2/3. School dropouts have declined by 50% in the United States. Binge drinking and alcohol usage have declined, and in spite of the fact that we're hearing a lot about bullying, school bullying, the indicators we have of that also show a considerable improvement. So being an American, I don't have an opportunity to be chauvinistic very often, but I actually think that there is something here that is very interesting and potentially important. There is some evidence that some of these trends apply in other places, but the kind of richness of the kind of survey data doesn't really exist to the same degree. But here is some evidence for the UK showing some declines in data from two points in time, 1998 and 2009. The NSPCC survey showing declines in physical violence, verbal aggression, and coercive sexual acts. And here's some other parental violence indicators that have also declined according to that survey. And there are also some indicators from places like New Zealand, Germany, that show declines as well. But I really can't vouch for what's going on in other places. It's something maybe we should discuss. We can have a lot of discussion about what's going on that accounts for all of this. I call it the search for the smoking wand. There are many theories. I'm not going to go through them all. Maybe other people are perhaps going to talk about them. But we clearly like to enhance, extend, and perhaps export some of what might be working. Obviously, one place to look for what might be working is among the kinds of programs that have been widely disseminated that we do know from research evidence have some effectiveness. So there's probably going to be a lot of people with their favorite list of these programs that have shown some efficacy in reducing youth victimization and youth violence. This is my list of the ones that I think have some of the better evidence behind them. They've already been mentioned, a considerable number of them. I think ones that haven't come up so prominently that I would particularly put on the agenda include this next to last one, mentoring, which has shown to be effective in the United States. And then one that doesn't get very much discussion at all, but that is psychiatric medication. There are quite a few randomized clinical trials that show that 4 classes of psychiatric medication are indeed effective at reducing youth violence. The stimulants, the antidepressants, the antipsychotics, and the mood stabilizers. And I know this issue is a controversial one, but I think it is something that we need to think about. We now have data suggesting that about 9% of children in the United States are taking psychiatric medication, and the rates among teenagers may be as high as 15%. There is at least one kind of aggregate level data analysis that has linked it to some degree with overall crime decline. There are other evidence-based programs that we know that address important risk factors for violence and violence exposure. And we might want to think about those as well. And then there are a whole lot of, I'll come back to that, a whole lot of policies and practices that are, I would say, part of the package in the United States that people think about when they think about child violence prevention, but that haven't really been evaluated or haven't been evaluated very well. But these, it seems to me, are also good candidates for examination, and they include public awareness campaigns, they include statutory changes, including things like sex offender registries and the like. They include mandatory reporting laws that get people to report child maltreatment that they identify. They include an enormous amount of professional training that's gone on over this last generation. They include aggressive policing and prosecution. There's been tremendous ramping up of the degree to which police take both intrafamily violence and also peer aggression more seriously than they used to. There's been a lot of surveillance technology that's both been installed and disseminated. I like to just remind people that the cell phone is a tremendous crime prevention device. Most of the women that I know acquired it because they imagined themselves being stuck in a car at night and they wanted to be able to summon help. And I think young people use it that way considerably as well. And then we have the whole child protection system, which takes children out of dangerous homes and puts them into foster placement. Never really been evaluated in terms of whether it helps. But these are all things that are, I'd say, part of the package in the United States. So, now I want to, though, talk about the issue of what is involved in franchising this. What is involved in taking these to other places? What is involved in the way in which we think about how to disseminate these and other ideas to places where they don't currently exist? And I want to raise a number of questions that I think should be part of the discussion that we have about our strategy for going about doing this. And the first one concerns a kind of big level strategic vision about how to go about mobilizing other places. I operate, interestingly, in some different circles, and so I began to notice early on that people had very different implicit views of what they thought should take place as the kind of fundamental strategy. There were people who were primarily focused on influencing governments to get them to adopt policies. There were people who seemed to be primarily interested in influencing professionals and professional networks. And there were people who seemed to be primarily interested in working through non-governmental organizations. And that seemed to me to be three very different approaches that ought to be considered as, to some degree, alternatives in this work. Let me just sketch out how I see, and maybe I'm wrong in thinking about these as distinct, but I'd be curious about getting some feedback. We have, on the one hand, what I see as kind of the international governmental approach that's taken by UNICEF and the Convention on the Rights of Children, which kind of tries to push governments to incorporate child protection strategies into their government policy. With the understanding that if they do, there'll be a large mobilization, there'll be a wide geography that's affected, and the governments typically have the resources to put a lot of money into these efforts. So there's big potential, but there are also very serious problems with this strategy. There are few good examples around the world of it actually having worked. Governments can be very reluctant and fickle, and they can decide to do this under one administration, and then a new administration can come in, it's out the window. And third, these kind of mobilizations oftentimes have a lot of political baggage, as governments sort of want to direct the funding towards their favored sources or their favored ministries or their favored interest groups. By contrast, the professional network model, which I got involved in earlier on in my career through the association with the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, has focused much more on mobilizing professionals around the world, using networks of pediatricians, using networks of social workers, using networks of law enforcement agencies, and relying on what seems to me to be a intrinsic kind of professional ambition, which is to be up to date and modern in your knowledge base, and asking people, professionals in various countries, to get the kind of knowledge that's specific to their profession about the prevention and intervention in violence, and to take that into their practice. And because tends to be a shared values and vocabulary and knowledge base in these professions, the transfer, I think, has been relatively easy in a lot of places. And there's been some notable successes in this transfer. And I would put these countries up. There may be some others. Malaysia, Estonia, Colombia, Saudi Arabia, and Japan are all places where 20 years ago there was nothing going on. And now there's a considerable amount going on in the way of violence prevention activities in those places, mostly brought in through the professional networks. They have some durability in that these professionals, as far as I can see, tend to continue to do this and often rise in their local hierarchies and influence over time. But there are also some drawbacks to it. Sometimes the mobilization only happens within a narrow profession, like a pediatrician, like pediatrics. Oftentimes it lacks the interdisciplinary character we'd hope for. And sometimes it runs afoul of personality and career issues, individuals who may not be that popular or be that able to work in a kind of collaborative way with either the governments or other agencies. And then finally, I think there is this other model, which is to work through existing non-governmental organizations. We see kind of the ECPAT, Save the Children, World Vision as being examples of these kinds of mobilizations. The value here is that these organizations have existing infrastructure, familiarity with the terrain, a positive reputation in a lot of these places. There are valuable synergies because these organizations are working on other topics that are relevant, like women's issues or health or early childhood development. And you avoid the competition and rivalries that can occur when you try and enter a new environment with some new issues and new programs that other organizations see as distracting from the ones that they want to put a priority on. But you have issues here as well. Dilution of content or emphasis when you go with multi-focus organizations. There's some experience that when people feel a certain amount of ownership about some project or content, they may be more aggressive and successful in developing it and delivering it, and maybe you lose that when you're working with an organization that has multiple goals. I think we should be talking about this strategic issue more, comparing other international mobilizations for how these different kinds of strategy worked, talking about whether there are the possibility of mixed strategies. But when it comes down to where you're going to put your buck, you may have to decide to start out in one place versus another, and maybe we have to think about how we tailor these different choices to different country environments. I think it's something worth discussing. An issue that comes up, I think I'm going to just not talk about this proprietary mobilization issue. A second topic that Patricia and I thought was worth considering, and that is a lot of what comes most easily when we think about knowledge transfer and program transfer has to do with certain kind of self-contained, modular, circumscribed programs. And things like TFCBT, Shake and Baby, programs, bullying prevention, child interviewing protocols. These are all examples. And that kind of approach ignores some of the harder transfer problems, which have to do with whole institutional complexes, like mandatory reporting systems, or activities that involve a lot of cross-disciplinary work, like children's advocacy centers, or even getting broader value systems, like affection-based parenting or children's rights. Knowing how to kind of transfer these things, there's very much less evidence-based for these value systems or whole institutions, and yet there may be some way in which they are very important or can be very important. And the question is, should we be evaluating some of those?
5 minutes.
Okay. Then there's the question of whether we really need to be looking more outside the box. I think Bernadette raised this issue already. There are a whole set of non-child maltreatment issues that may have very direct material implications for violence prevention. And she mentioned universal schooling, but I would mention, and she mentioned women's education, but I would mention also contraception, family planning, alcohol regulation, control, economic development. And we don't know a lot about the potential impact of these on the child violence exposure. But here is something that I think should give us pause. There is a pretty strong correlation between family size and children's exposure to violence. There have been a few meta-analyses that have shown a kind of moderate effect size for this. But what's really interesting to see is how much of a decline there has been in family size over the last 40 years in the world. This is another, I think, unsung story success. But there's been worldwide fertility has declined by over half since 1960. And to the extent that that has reduced children's exposure to violence, that may actually have been one of the largest prevention effects that we have experienced. And it does raise the question of whether, say, taking the African fertility rate and bringing it into alignment with that of the other continents might not be the most effective thing that we could do. I don't know right now how to compare that with something like doing early childhood education or family early childhood family education. We need to be thinking, though, about these other kinds of... Here's another issue that I'd like people to consider, and this is that is that when you talk to people around the world, one of the things that comes to their mind in terms of protecting their kids is how to insulate them from some of the nefarious Western influences that they see as related to violence. So the divorce culture or the sexual objectification that goes along with a lot of the values, Western values, or the violent media that we disseminate around the world. There is evidence that these things do contribute to violence. So they're not wrong in thinking that this is part of the problem. But we don't tend to have much to offer them in dealing with these kinds of things. And I think parts of our package might want to address this as well. Okay. Just a couple of other things. There's going to be a lot of talk about evidence-based programming. We all know the benefits of that, but there are some limitations to relying only on evidence-based programming. Some programs are intrinsically harder to evaluate. We need laboratories for new concepts, and we may not get that if we rely solely on disseminating only evidence-based programs. And we may have to adapt some of these programs. I have been impressed, and I just want to bring to your attention the work of Mark Lipsy. Some of you may be familiar with him, but he's done a lot of work with a huge database that he has of evidence-based programs to identify what are overall components of programs that seem to be associated with effectiveness. And he's developing rating systems for rating untested programs to see what the likelihood for success would be based on the track record of ones that have been successful. I think that this is something that we should study and make more use of in thinking about how to move forward in dissemination. Okay. I'm going to just finish up with my suggestions. More forums for debate about strategy, inventories of international policies and practices, more case studies about this transfer, both successful and unsuccessful, studies of the violence prevention effects of non-child abuse and neglect programming, particularly family planning, education, alcohol control. More evaluation of whole policies. And just a couple of one other thing that I think might be useful. I noticed that in a lot of the work that's being done on the transfer, we are using a categorization of international environments that was really developed for other purposes. So we categorize countries and places according to their location in the world and according to their level of economic development, by and large. But there really are other dimensions that might be very important and very useful in trying to make decisions about transfer and development. Things like traditional family, religious values. And I think we need to go about thinking about how to group together these countries for the purposes of thinking about these issues in a more empirical way. Okay. Let's see. Here we have the original violence against children consultant and a rather primitive intervention strategy. But at least I think someone who has inspired our thinking about preventing violence against kids. We've come a long way, but I do think that we're still on the side of the angels in what we are trying to do. I'll stop there, and if you want to get more information about this, we have this publication that's going to be out in Child Abuse and Neglect that covers a lot of these issues. Okay, thank you.